Hello, and welcome to Tech Connects, Dice's podcast where we dig into topics on tech hiring, recruiting, and careers that matter to you. I'm your host, Nick Kolakowski, and I'm going to talk to great guests every month about the current state of the tech careers world, including the tech job market, the hottest tech skills, what companies are doing to attract and retain technology professionals in a historically tight market, and much more. Our next guest is Dylan Etkin, CEO and co-founder of Sleuth, a company that helps engineering teams measure and improve their efficiency. If you use JIRA, the application that allows teams to manage projects and keep track of bugs and other issues, you're already familiar with Dylan's work, as he was the lead developer on JIRA for 5 years. He was also head of development and operations teams for Bitbucket, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. In other words, Dylan is uniquely positioned to provide some fascinating insights into making engineering teams more efficient, how development teams can make great decisions that take everyone's views into account, and much more. So let's listen in. So thank you for being on. Like we were saying right before I hit the record button, you're one of the original architects of JIRA, and so many people in tech use JIRA, and obviously it gives you incredible insight into engineering teams and measuring what they're doing, how they're doing it, hopefully improving their efficiency a little bit along the way. So I'm really grateful that you agreed to do this. I think this will be a fun discussion.
Yeah, glad to be here.
Cool. So one thing that I really wanted to talk to you about, especially since you're the CEO and co-founder of Sleuth, which is a company that is designed to, help engineering teams measure and improve their efficiency and things like that. Efficiency is a huge issue for development teams everywhere, whether they're large or small. Many software developer, they complain that management above them doesn't really grasp what it takes to come into a project, and that rushing something out the door isn't necessarily the best way to do it, and that there are better ways to be efficient, better ways to spend resources and things. And then management obviously has a different perspective on that sometimes, especially if management doesn't come from an engineering background. They're looking at different metrics, they want different things. And so there's this sort of this disconnect, or this lack of sort of seeing a kind of a holistic picture almost. And I'm just wondering, from your perspective, given all of your insight into this, how do engineers and managers solve for this? How does everybody sort of get on the same page and get efficient and complete projects on time and on budget? What's your top level view on all that?
Yeah, that's a great question. And honestly, we could probably just spend the entire time talking about that because it's complicated. So, I think we have to zoom out a couple levels just to really talk about that appropriately.
Yeah.
And I think that efficiency in engineering has been something that we've always wanted to get a handle on, but have very rarely been able to do so. So, I like to joke that, back in the days of punch card programming, it was probably the person who had the smallest stack that was the most efficient engineer, right? Obviously, a terrible measure of efficiency. And then we took that even further as the industry's kind of moved on. We moved on to this idea of lines of code and different ways of auditing what engineering is up to. But I think we're mature enough now to recognize that engineering is a somewhat creative and somewhat scientific endeavor. And you can make a ton of impact with a 5-line change that took you 3 or 4 days to actually figure out because it was some hectic performance-y thing or algorithm or whatever. And it's definitely the case that developers are very wary of measurement. They're very wary of management measuring the wrong things, things that don't really matter and don't have a real indicative intent of what you were actually doing. Now, we've kind of entered in my mind, a golden age where this is actually quantifiable now, right? Mm-hmm. So I think a similar thing happened with Salesforce, right? Where you had sales teams that had measures of efficiency that they'd kind of ad hoc put together, but then Salesforce came along and said, we're going to give you process. We're going to take the tools that you're already using and we're going to give you insights into that. And we're going to show you where things are falling down, where your bottlenecks are. And the sales folks couldn't really argue with it because they were like, this is helping me, not hurting me. And it's an accurate measure of our effectiveness. So for software engineering, that's been kind of the DORA metrics, more broadly, the move to DevOps and saying, we're going to move to frequent deploys. We're going to try and minimize our batch sizes. We're going to try and get smaller and smaller changes out so that we reduce the blast area. We are going to take into account, how things land for the customer. We're not going to move fast and break shit, and this kind of cultural shift. And then also that in concert with a giant move to cloud tooling has really opened up the arena for being able to say, let's take the real work that people are working on and glean some metrics that are reproducible so that we can have this conversation about efficiency. So that's a long-winded intro to, I believe that we're in a place right now where we can actually start to have these conversations.
No, I mean, I think that was a perfect intro. It makes me think of vanity metrics almost, where you have, certain groups within an organization will be like, they care about something for, maybe it's an internal political reason, or maybe it's because they think that something is going to have more exterior business impact than it will. But it seems to me almost that, if you sort of systematize it and adopt these systems, that the fear of sort of focusing on the wrong thing then potentially goes away. The engineers can show that, like this, and then everyone's sort of aligned on going towards those KPIs and those goals that actually seem to fit. I guess, I mean, so at Sleuth, I mean, in terms of all this, I mean, we've talked sort of on a big, sort of more abstract level about it, but I mean, how does that work in terms of what Sleuth is doing? I mean, how are you sort of contributing and pushing towards that goal and so helping everyone kind of get efficient and aligned?
Yeah. So I basically what it comes down to is properly capturing the work that is actually being done. And I think that that's a huge difference. Like, lines of code, yeah, you did a certain something, but what were you trying to accomplish, right? And also the idea of, rather than looking at an individual, looking at a team, right? Because looking at individuals, you start to stack rank. It can become this like toxic thing where you're not necessarily pushing the culture of your team to be better. You're focusing on the wrong problem. And so what it looks like when you're focusing on the team, and again, through this lens of DORA metrics, you can say, all right, I'm going to attach to existing systems. And maybe that's like a GitHub or a Bitbucket or an Azure or, GitLab or one of these systems that's going to do source control and reviews. So like, there's definitely some development tool primitives that exist nowadays, and you got like issue trackers, like a JIRA or a Linear or Shortcut or, one of these tools out there. You're going to have a CI/CD system that's going to be, a Circle CI or an AWS code deploy or, a GitHub Actions or one of these things. And you're going to have some measure of failure. You're going to have probably multiple measures of failure. You're going to have like an incident management system and a PagerDuty or a status page. You're going to have like a metrics system and like a Datadog or a New Relic. And, these tend to be toolings that most teams have adopted. And so what you can do is you can connect up to these different tools where I like to think of it as the individuals in your organization, they're paying into each one of these tools daily, right? When you're doing work in JIRA, you're making an investment in that tool every day to like update your status, add comments, do these things. So the work is happening, right? And what we're able to do at this point is to connect up to these different systems, glean that information, and then extract these like high quality measures of efficiency that reflect the actual work that's going out, and that can look like deploying something, you open a pull request. We want to tell you how long you've spent coding. We want to tell you how long it takes for that pull request to actually get looked at. Then we want to tell you like, after you've looked at it for the first time, how long has it taken to go through that review process where you go back and forth. And then once you've merged it, that's a whole other journey, right? Like maybe you have 4 different environments at your organization. So you want to know, when did it get to testing? When did it get to, acceptance? When did it get to staging? When did it get to production? And what did that journey look like? Because, there could be bottlenecks in there. And again, that's not necessarily reflecting on the individual, that's reflecting on the team and how you're working as a team and what efficiency looks like inside of your organization.
One thing, now that you mention it, in terms of all these processes and flow, and I mean, anybody who's dealt with JIRA or another project management suite, monitoring a huge project like a website redesign or an app launch or what have you, I mean, knows that the computational complexity gets very large very quickly. I mean, things have a potential to spin up. You've got tons of pages everywhere, tons of product owners and other people who are trying to kind of go in and constantly keep everything updated. What do you think about? I mean, what role does automation play in sort of helping people who are working in these systems sort of take off, sort of automated enough that they don't have to sort of constantly focus and constantly devote as much energy to kind of monitoring stuff as they do to actually kind of doing the work? Because it seems like that's a huge issue that project management has wrestled with for a very long time. But now we're starting to get into a phase where, automation and AI to a certain extent are kind of more prominent. I'm just wondering if that's going to become a factor in all this as well, like more automation
Yeah.
of, yeah.
I mean, I feel like you're either reading our product roadmap or our marketing material, and so I mean, you've hit the nail on the head. I mean, even if we zoom out a tiny bit, like how has in our software engineering industry moved ourselves forward? I think you could argue the case that it's almost always through automation. So, back in the day when unit testing became a thing, there was a small window where we did those things and we ran the tests on our laptops. But very quickly, we decided, hey, this is ripe for automation. We can use a Jenkins or we can use a Bamboo or later generations in Circle CI to make this repeatable, right? Similarly, when I first started working and when I was running the Bitbucket team, our deployments had manual steps in them, right? It looked like SSHing into servers and restarting services, and we had somebody who was more traditional ops than like somebody who was managing like AWS in the cloud. Would you ever create a software team that way today? Highly unlikely, right? You're going to automate that deploy so that it becomes a non-event, and so and every time we automate something, we remove toil from like the developer and from the team that's managing a thing, and that allows them to focus on that next rung up on the staircase, that higher level order of the thing that you're actually trying to do. And we're absolutely there today with engineering efficiency as well.
Mm-hmm.
We have a release coming up on Sleuth we're really excited about in the early August timeframe. We're already in beta right now, where we have an automations marketplace. And the whole goal of that is to say, look, there's been 10, 15 years of software teams building bespoke tools and workflows, like things like guardrails, where you're saying, we never merge a pull request when we're in an incident. We never open a pull request without an issue key reference, right? Like this is a guardrail where you're saying like, this keeps us on track. This keeps us at a quality level that we want. We're never going to deviate from this. Or you can have like notifications where you say, when we deploy to staging, we're going to alert the people who were a part of that so that they are aware and they can do smoke tests or that sort of thing. Or, if you're trying to track towards a goal, you can have a smart notification that lets you say, hey, you better get on this review because you're, 2 hours away from busting this goal that you guys have as a team. Similarly, sometimes teams will set up some sort of automated action, like if this, then that, like if a thing triggers in Datadog, add a comment to a JIRA issue, and then give a link back to an environment such that they can see it. Or even just, really complicated things like workflows saying, I want to, via Slack, approve, promotion of a deploy from a staging environment to a production environment. Now, I've run engineering teams in the past where I've taken a senior engineer and said, you've got 3 weeks to build this thing. As a team, we've decided that this will help us be more efficient. This will help us get our work done better. And then they go off and they build this bespoke thing, and they have to interact with, I don't know, the GitHub API, the JIRA API, Bamboo's API. They have to figure out where they're hiding a secret key for the API access and all this stuff. And, we also then don't have a measure of whether that's actually effective or not. We have the sunk cost fallacy that we just spent 3 weeks on it, so it must be good. But yeah, I mean, I think that we're in the place right now where we can take these best practices that teams have built around their software development lifecycle. We can automate those, and we can interact with all these complicated systems to give you these higher level workflows to really help with efficiency. And I think that's the key to continuous improvement, right? Is you have to experiment, measure how the experiment went, make sure that you have a baseline that you're comparing against, decide if it went well or poorly, and either keep it, remove it, and then try again. You just got to keep that circle rolling.
It would also seem to be really helpful in the sense of like a lot of teams these days, it's not like a monolithic cluster where it's all full-time engineers or whatever. You have, I've worked on projects where you have like a bunch of contractors over here who might, have only sort of a lower level of knowledge at GitHub or whatever than kind of the full-time people over there. You've got managers who are trying to monitor the workflow and so on. And so guardrails that seem to be kind of efficient for given how a lot of teams are hybridized in terms of roles and skill levels and contractors and things like that. Because I mean, we've all seen instances where, yeah, without guardrails and so on, like these things can like spin wildly out of control and so on, and then it's a real issue.
Yeah,
Cool.
I mean, just to make a point on that is DevOps is amazing because it's taken the locus of control and given it closer to the people who are doing the actual work. But the double-edged sword of that is that it's a lot more to understand, and it's a lot like if you don't have automations in place and you don't have a proper flow in place, you're really genuinely overloading your individuals and not giving them the tools that they need to be successful. If you have to understand every metric in Datadog to decide if a deploy was successful or not, like you're going to spend all your time doing that. You're not going to have enough time for other things, right? So you need to have a system that says these are the 4 or 5 North Stars that I'm going to care about. And then you have to bring that information to the individuals, not have them have to go figure out where the hell that stuff actually lives.
Yeah, which flows into the other point, which I was interested in breaking down, which is, when it comes to efficiency and measurement and so on, I mean, what are the other challenges in addition to that teams face? I mean, there's obviously the complexity issue, and the reporting issue to a certain extent. But I mean, a lot of teams today, I mean, is it communication issues? Is it from what you've seen, is it resource issues? I mean, kind of what are the top things that these tools can help solve?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many different ways, right? Like, and there's so many different teams and different life cycles of their journey. And so, there's like, I'd say the first one is just cultural, right? Where you're like, does an organization understand why this is important? And are they invested in being an organization that wants to do continuous learning? So, like we've worked with organizations that want to make that transition, but the PMs don't understand what it's going to look like to deploy frequently. They don't understand like how are we going to do that? How are we going to turn things on and turn things off? Aren't we going to make a mess of things? Like marketing can often be, culturally misaligned with that sort of goal because they want to do a big bang announcement and they're not quite sure how to understand when you're shipping incrementally, how that would work. And even just, execs, right? Like there needs to be a genuine buy-in that like moving faster is going to be better for the customer. It's going to be better for your overall organizational efficiency, and it's going to help the bottom line of the org, right? So, I mean, there's a lot of good stuff out there. There's like, the Accelerate book, the State of DevOps reports. Like there's a lot of things that basically, if you need to make a case culturally that this is a good thing to do, I think there's a lot of support out there for doing that sort of thing.
I love the state of the DevOps reports, just as an aside. I
Yeah,
mean, yeah, the Stack Overflow stuff is just like, it's amazing in terms of like just a deep dive.
yeah, absolutely. And like you say, I think communication is another area where teams can run into trouble, right? Like, so again, you're moving faster, which means there's more moving parts, which means there's more opportunity to step on each other's toes or to not be clear on how things are meant to work. So, having like a clear definition of like, this is what it means to deploy. Like, this is what it means when you're done. Like, this is what our definition of done looks like. And again, having automations in place to help define that makes it all very clear. Like, that's a form of communication too. Like, you have a new member who joins your team, their first question is, how do we work? Right.
Yeah.
And how do I know? Like, how will I learn that? And if it's an ecosystem that makes it very hard to do things in a way that are not the right way for your team, right? Like that can come from automation and communication tools.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Hmm. That's a lot. I mean, it's so complex. I mean, one of the things too. I mean, especially with what you, as you mentioned, like the speed of decision making and the complexity of it, and so on, and all these different people. You know, as you say, you got executives, you got marketing, and so on. In addition to the engineers, and so when it comes to decision making, particularly like the ultra crucial decisions, like do we need to include this feature, or what metrics should we be measuring, or can we meet things by this deadline? Um, you obviously need all team members' input in on that. And I guess the question is, I don't know if you want to call it the democratization of decision making or whatever, but I mean, how do you think organizations can sort of make sure that everyone's opinions and ideas and so on are taken in account, especially if it can be done like within the framework of a platform that allows people to like kind of put their ideas down or their needs?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. I had thought about that question a little bit, and
Hmm.
I might have a different opinion now that I'm a business owner than I did when I was an engineering manager.
Hmm.
You
How so?
know, because I have coming spending lots and lots of years at Atlassian. I think we definitely invested in hiring really smart people. And when you do that, you want to make sure that you're giving them the opportunity to have inputs, and that you're using basically that smarts. Um, but there's definitely something to be said for death by democracy when it comes to moving really quickly and product decisions, and specifically in a startup where you're trying to find product market fit,
Hmm.
right? Like there is something to having a vision and charting a course to that vision, obviously not with blinders on, but cutting through some of the red tape that comes with like committee
Yeah.
when trying to do things, And so I think a way a lot of teams are trying to walk that balance today is through like a DevOps approach where you're saying, look, we're going to get you, everybody's going to be involved, right? Like the PM and the designer and the engineers are talking constantly, and we're
Hmm.
working on like such small batch sizes that we're saying, hey, this is a collaboration as we go, and you're not going away for 5 weeks and just like building this like giant thing that you're just going to land, right?
Hmm.
Instead, you have a lot of opportunity for course correction as you go. So
Yeah.
you're delivering smaller increments, and you're saying you are empowered to take the product and design input to turn that into something real. But then you're also going to work with those folks to be like, does this seem right? And then you're going to push that out into production and then do it again. And so in that way, you do have input. You're very involved in the process, but maybe you're not overly democratized.
Yeah. I mean, it's always been sort of a marvel to me where, obviously smaller teams can follow that. But then you look at like large organizations, like I think Valve is the one that people keep citing, where it's a holacracy almost, where they say
Mm,
that everything's like completely flattened and everybody is sort of equally empowered, and that everybody sort of can manage their workflow in their own way. And whenever I read references to that, I'm like, are those organizations actually practicing what they're preaching, or is it a lot
right.
more sort of structured in terms of their sprints and their hierarchy and everything than they sort of like want to kind of let on? Whatever Gabe Newell is doing over here is actually like much more hierarchical and traditional than that.
Yeah. I don't know. There's a classic example that I had some vantage into. Uh, and So GitHub, right? Like in the
Hmm.
very early days of GitHub was a meritocracy as well.
Oh, okay.
Now I worked
Huh.
on Bitbucket when GitHub was in its heyday.
Hmm.
We were always about 1/3 the size of GitHub. We were chasing them, and like it's an amazing product. It's done very well under Microsoft as well. I love GitHub. We use it all the time now.
Yeah.
Uh, but I do know that they moved at an incredible speed when they were about 30,
Hmm.
and they had like super smart people, and they were just all very motivated to move their stuff across the line. They went into this long period, like a couple of years, where they just had paralysis, right? Where nobody quite had the authority to take a thing across the line,
Hmm.
but you still had this like meritocracy and this very flat structure. And I think it hurt them, like I remember speaking to Nat Friedman, the former GitHub CEO, and him saying, yeah, when he came in, he was like, I know we have 150 things just sitting there like 90% done. I want to ship one a day. Like, let's clear the croft, right? But it took somebody to sort of step in and say, enough, right?
Yeah.
Like enough with this. Like we have to move it forward. And so it feels like that very meritocratic environment struggles a little bit when you have an organization that's large enough that it's not exactly clear what it takes to get something across the line.
I also feel it's the sort of thing, potentially, I could be very wrong on this, where even if you have sort of like the best system set up, for sort of monitoring, making sure things efficient, making sure things are signed off on and pushed over the line, that there's almost like this human factor to it, this like last mile human factor where you can have all this set up and it's great, but if there's not a human being like sort of saying like, okay, we're doing this, this is how we're going, this is what we're doing in this moment, then it's kind of all for naught despite that setup.
Yeah.
If
But
only.
I mean, it's also, I guess, super interesting that a lot of these the FANG companies in this current economic downturn have decided to get rid of a layer of middle management. Like they're just saying like that middle manager, we're going to flatten it out. We're going to flatten our structure because we feel like we've gotten too many rungs of decision making built into our process now. So
A long time ago when I was at eWeek, my primary beat was covering Microsoft during the Ballmer years, and I remember talking to people on the team that had worked on um, people who had been longtime Microsoft people at that point, but who had worked on XP, Windows XP, and they were saying that, I mean, the team that was just focused on the start button in terms of like the layers of management and then the actual people doing implementation and so on was dozens. It was dozens of people for this, and obviously, the start button in terms of everybody's real estate is probably one of the most important, kind of things that they were working on. But even so, it just seemed that I remember thinking at the time, like, whoa, you could probably lose half of those people, flatten it by half, and you would
yeah.
probably still be good. So I mean, it's then at Meta right now, I mean, Mark Zuckerberg was like, unless you're an individual contributor in some fashion, then you're out the door, even if you were in management. And I heard um, not directly. So I mean, this is with a very hefty grain of salt, but that some managers actually walked out the door because they didn't want to. They felt it was a demotion to
Mhm.
actually be contributing to product, and I thought that was interesting too because I mean, I like building stuff. Most people
Yeah.
like building things, but I mean, some people wanted to be at that management level. They didn't. I mean, just it was interesting in terms of some
Yeah.
people deal with that
I
better.
think it's a thing that it's an experiment that our industry is currently running.
Hmm.
Because I mean, it goes to that thing of like I think there's always been a question of, are you an organization where your engineering managers code, or are you an organization where they don't? And I know where my opinion falls on that one. Um, I've always felt like if you're running a large enough organization, you shouldn't be coding. It's the wrong focus for you, because efficient teams takes investment and time and conscious decisions, and that having to carve out 30% of your week just to code it gets weird. You can't be
Yeah.
critical path for anything, and I think you can be really effective without that. But I know
Mhm.
that that's not always the popular opinion, and so we'll see where this experiment goes.
I also wonder, I mean, Amazon was famous for what was it? I forget how many pizzas it was. I think it's two pizza teams. No team
Two
should be
pizza team.
larger than can be fed with two pizzas. And I do wonder if they still hold to that in terms of like their infrastructure and so on. And I mean, it definitely seems that, I mean, in terms of like managing projects and so on, like that sort of is potentially an ideal team size. I should ask. I don't have that as many Amazon
I mean,
contacts
we
as I
see
used
that
to.
with our larger customers.
Yeah.
We definitely we get adopted by like segments of an organization. So like we work with Volvo, but we work with only parts of Volvo, right? And again,
Mhm.
they sort of organize on those two pizza teams, maybe slightly larger, maybe four pizzas.
Yeah.
But and it was the same at Atlassian too. I think I started there when it was 20 people.
Mhm.
And by the time I left the second time, it was 4,000. I think they're up to like 6 or 8 now or something like that.
Wow.
And they still have like, their Compass team is, I think 50 people that's broken up into, 10 different teams. And so they're still kind of organizing in that way.
For those larger teams, and this is actually another question that I had for you. I mean, what? if you're a manager and you've, because of hypergrowth or whatever, all of a sudden you've got way more than like the 7 recommended reports or however many they're saying these days should be directly reported into. Like if you have a massive team, like in addition to having good software backing you to help kind of like manage things, I mean, like what skills, I mean, how do people do it? How do you manage a team of that massive size? I mean, and make sure this plates all keep spinning.
Right. I mean, that's a great question. Unfortunately, we see a little less of that in the last year than we saw previously, where like these companies are going through hyper growth. It's tends to be the other direction right now for a lot of organizations. But yeah, that was definitely a driver for people seeking out a tool like Sleuth. Was to say, look, we knew when there were 4 of us that we were pretty effective. And then when there was 8 of us, like we felt like, yeah, there's some cracks, but I think we're pulling this off. Then we grew 10x and now there's 80 of us. And like, we don't even know if we're shipping, once every 3 months, and we don't know where that bottleneck lies. And so arming their leaders with tooling to understand, like, where the biggest bottlenecks are in their process and their, the things that they have in place to sort of support that organization is a great step. Now, I think it's a different conversation of, do you have one manager who was managing 4 people and is now managing 80? Like, I don't think there's a way to scale that. You know what I mean? Like that person's just screwed.
True. Yeah, no, definitely. Yikes. Cool. So this was a great chat. Thank you so much. And that's it, folks. I had a great time talking to Dylan because, as you could tell from the episode, he thinks so deeply about the project management issues that dominate our work lives. Here are some key takeaways from our discussion. First, there's a growing realization that engineering is a combination of the creative and the scientific. It's not about how many lines of code you write or how many features you ship within a particular quarter. Sometimes, the most effective developer or engineer on the team is the one who only writes a few lines of code after thinking very carefully for days or even weeks. As you figure out your team's deliverables, KPIs, and measures of efficiency, you need to think carefully about what actually matters in terms of goals and measurements, and plan accordingly. Second, when it comes to project management, automation will only get better. In theory, project management tools will allow teams to hand off more monitoring and management processes to an algorithm, allowing human beings to focus more on important work. And that's a good thing. But as we pursue automation, we need to be careful to make sure proper guardrails are in place so that automation doesn't mess up processes or make things overly complicated. Third, it seems like big tech companies such as Meta are embracing efficiency and trying to take away layers of management. Across the tech industry, it's all about smaller teams, fewer managers, and more individual contributors. As Dylan says, this is going to be an interesting experiment over the next few years. Do you really need a thick layer of middle management? How many managers are too much? And should managers actually be coding or devoting all of their energies to actually running teams? We covered a lot of other topics during the interview, so give it a re-listen if there was something you missed. And we'll see you next time. Remember, Dice is your best resource to find the tech talent you need to fill your open roles, and for technology professionals, the best place to grow your tech career.